Hello and welcome. In this lecture we're going to be architecting our gun such that when we hit the mouse button or the trigger, then we are going to get a log message, and this log message is the first step in getting many other things running off the back of this gun architecture. Let's dive in and see how it's done. So we want this gun ultimately to be able to shoot, and that is the core of it. Why are we choosing to have the gun as the core of our shooting architecture? Well, as I've already alluded to a little bit, we want to be able to support different types of methods of shooting. Now, what are the kinds of methods of shooting that we can typically have? There is direct fire, which often uses ray tracing and direct line of sight to ascertain whether or not a victim has been hit. So we'd go and say, okay, I can see that enemy, that line of sight from the gun to the enemy is clear, it hits him, so we have to do him damage. Otherwise, if I missed and I didn't hit the enemy, it doesn't do damage. That's one very easy way. It doesn't really replicate the physics of a bullet, but there's no need to. So for performance reasons, we don't. Now, with a rocket launcher or something like that, it's often a very slow projectile. We want to see the effect of that projectile moving through the air, and the time delay can be important, in which case we might spawn that projectile and see whether the projectile hits in 5 seconds time. Or we might go down a different route with bullet drop and rifles and sniper rifles over long distances. So all of this could change depending on the implementation of our gun. Now, we're going to implement one gun during this section. It's going to be a rifle, a direct shooting type of gun. But in order to leave that architecture open for you to extend, we are going to make the gun responsible for doing shooting. So that means we have to go ahead and introduce some shooting architecture into our gun. So we've got a gun.h. We want to create a public function to this that is going to allow us to essentially pull the trigger on the gun from the shooter character or from wherever we're binding input. In the case of the enemy, for example, we're going to be pulling that trigger from the AI. So let's go ahead and create a void. It doesn't have to have a return type, pull trigger method. And it doesn't need to take anything. All we need to know is that we want to pull the trigger in this frame. So having that is sufficient. Now I'm going to go ahead and create the implementation with Control-Shift-P and create implementation. And then in here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to put a UE log, and I'm just going to make it warning to stand out and change the message to you've been shot, like that. And that's great. So that's what we're going to call in our character.cpp. So this is going to be a challenge to you. It is some more input binding. We've done lots of input binding here. You've got lots of examples of input binding. Go ahead and do this to hook up a shoot action. You're going to have to create a new action in the project settings for shooting. Bind that to your key, your right trigger, whatever you want to bind it to. Then bind it in the character, set up player input component method to do this, and then after binding the character, you should be able to call the pull trigger from within the function that you have created on the character. Remember to put a function in to character in order to set up the binding rather than trying to bind directly to that gun. Binding directly to the gun isn't going to work. You need to put a little function intermediary in there. So pause the video and I'll give you a little bit of a hint or a little bit of a start if you're struggling with that last part of the challenge of creating the intermediary function. Okay, so here comes the hint. If you don't want the hints, pause now. But the hint is going to be, we're going to do something like this, which is to have a new private function called void shoot and create the implementation over in C++. And it's going to be in here that we call to the gun's own method. So the gun's pull trigger, we're going to do gun and then call pull trigger on that from within shoot. And this is what you need to bind. Okay, so pause the video again if that's where you want to take things. And then let's go and set up the actions. Okay, so we're going to go over to our project settings. So settings, project settings, and we want to dock this and go to our input, and we want to add a new action, and we're going to call it shoot. And then we're going to bind this to the left mouse button and the right trigger, not the right trigger axis, the right just trigger. I thought that's what I'd selected, but I had not. Okay, so we're binding to both controller and mouse, and then we're going to go over and bind the axis in our shooter character CPP. So copy this bind axis for jump. I mean action, of course. I'm always going to get those two mixed up. We'll switch over to the shoot axis here. The pressed is what we want. And instead of binding to jump, we're going to bind to a character shoot instead, like so. And let's go ahead and build. Okay, it looks like that has succeeded. Let's close that on down and see if it works. So let's exit the game and hit play again and have a look at our output log crucially. Hit play. Yay! So if I hit the mouse button, it is working. Let's see if the same thing happens if I use my right trigger. Yep, right trigger is working too for firing. So obviously a log message is not the best way of letting your player know that something is going on in the game. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at adding in particle effects to do just that. I'll see you there.